The moon has a smell. It has no air, but it has a smell. Each pair of Apollo astronauts to land on the moon tramped lots of moon dust back into the lunar module. It was deep gray, fine-grained and extremely clingy, and when they unsnapped their helmets, Neil Armstrong said, "We were aware of a new scent in the air of the cabin that clearly came from all the lunar material that had accumulated on and in our clothes." To him, it was the scent of wet ashes. To his Apollo 11 crewmate Buzz Aldrin, it was the smell in the air after a firecracker has gone off. All the astronauts who walked on the moon noticed it, and many commented on it to mission control. Harrison Schmitt, the geologist who flew on Apollo 17, the last lunar landing, said after his second moonwalk, "Smells like someone's been firing a carbine in here." Almost unaccountably, no one had warned lunar module pilot Jim Irwin about the dust. When he took off his helmet inside the cramped lunar module cabin, he said, "There's a funny smell in here." His Apollo 15 crewmate Dave Scott said, "Yeah, I think that's the lunar dirt smell. Never smelled lunar dirt before, but we got most of it right here with us." Moon dust was a mystery that the National Aeronautics and Space Administration had, in fact, thought about. Cornell University astrophysicist Thomas Gold warned NASA that the dust had been isolated from oxygen for so long that it might well be highly chemically reactive. If too much dust was carried inside the lunar module's cabin, the moment the astronauts repressurized it with air and the dust came into contact with oxygen, it might start burning, or even cause an explosion. Gold, who correctly predicted early on that the moon's surface would be covered with powdery dust, also had warned NASA that the dust might be so deep that the lunar module and the astronauts themselves could sink irretrievably into it. Among the thousands of things they were keeping in mind while flying to the moon, Armstrong and Aldrin had been briefed about the very small possibility that the lunar dust could ignite. "A late July fireworks display on the moon was not something advisable," said Aldrin. Armstrong and Aldrin did their own test. Just a moment after he became the first human being to step onto the moon, Armstrong had scooped a bit of lunar dirt into a sample bag and put it in a pocket of his spacesuit, a contingency sample, in the event the astronauts had to leave suddenly without collecting rocks. Back inside the lunar module, the duo opened the bag and spread the lunar soil on top of the ascent engine. As they repressurized the cabin, they watched to see if the dirt started to smolder. "If it did, we'd stop pressurization, open the hatch and toss it out," Aldrin explained. But nothing happened. The moon dust turned out to be so clingy and so irritating that on the one night that Armstrong and Aldrin spent in the lunar module on the surface of the moon, they slept in their helmets and gloves, in part to avoid breathing the dust floating around inside the cabin. By the time the moon rocks and dust got back to Earth, a total of 842 pounds from 6 lunar landings, the odor was gone from the samples, exposed to air and moisture in their storage boxes. No one has quite figured out what caused the odor to begin with, or why it was so like spent gunpowder, which is chemically nothing like moon rock. "Very distinctive smell," Apollo 12 Commander Pete Conrad said. "I'll never forget. And I've never smelled it again since then." In 1999, as the century was ending, the historian Arthur Schlesinger Jr. was among a group of people who was asked to name the most significant human achievement of the 20th century. In ranking the events, Schlesinger said, "I put DNA and penicillin and the computer and the microchip in the first 10 because they've transformed civilization. But in 500 years, if the United States of America still exists, most of its history will have faded to invisibility. Pearl Harbor will be as remote as the War of the Roses," said Schlesinger. The one thing for which this century will be remembered 500 years from now was, this was the century when we began the exploration of space. He picked the first moon landing, Apollo 11, as the most significant event of the 20th century. The trip from one small planet to its smaller nearby moon might someday seem as routine to us as a commercial flight today from Dallas to New York City. But it is hard to argue with Schlesinger's larger observation, in the Chronicle of Humanity, the first missions by people from Earth through space to another planetary body are unlikely ever to be lost to history, to memory, or to storytelling. The leap to the moon in the 1960s was an astonishing accomplishment. But why? What made it astonishing? We've lost track not just of the details, we've lost track of the plot itself. What exactly was the hard part? The answer is simple: when President John F. Kennedy declared in 1961 that the United States would go to the moon, He was committing the nation to do something we simply couldn't do. We didn't have the tools or equipment, the rockets or the launch pads, the spacesuits or the computers or the microgravity food. And it isn't just that we didn't have what we would need, we didn't even know what we would need. We didn't have a list, no one in the world had a list. Indeed, our unpreparedness for the task goes a level deeper, we didn't even know how to fly to the moon. We didn't know what course to fly to get there from here. And as the small example of lunar dirt shows, we didn't know what we would find when we got there. Physicians worried that people wouldn't be able to think in microgravity conditions. Mathematicians worried that we wouldn't be able to calculate how to rendezvous two spacecraft in orbit, to bring them together in space and dock them in flight both perfectly and safely. On May 25, 1961, when Kennedy asked Congress to send Americans to the moon before the 1960s were over, NASA had no rockets to launch astronauts to the moon, no computer portable enough to guide a spaceship to the moon, no spacesuits to wear on the way, no spaceship to land astronauts on the surface, let alone a moon car to let them drive around and explore, no network of tracking stations to talk to the astronauts en route. When Kennedy asked us to do that in 1961, it was impossible, said Chris Kraft, the man who invented mission control. We made it possible. We, the United States, made it possible. 10,000 problems had to be solved to get us to the moon. Every one of those challenges was tackled and mastered between May 1961 and July 1969. The astronauts, the nation, flew to the moon because hundreds of thousands of scientists, engineers, managers and factory workers unraveled a series of puzzles, often without knowing whether the puzzle had a good solution. In retrospect, the results are both bold and bemusing. The Apollo spacecraft ended up with what was, for its time, the smallest, fastest and most nimble computer in a single package anywhere in the world. That computer navigated through space and helped the astronauts operate the ship. But the astronauts also traveled to the moon with paper star charts so they could use a sextant to take star sightings, like 18th century explorers on the deck of a ship, and cross-check their computer's navigation. The software of the computer was stitched together by women sitting at specialized looms, using wire instead of thread. In fact, an arresting amount of work across Apollo was done by hand. The heat shield was applied to the spaceship by hand with a fancy caulking gun. The parachutes were sewn by hand, and then folded by hand. The only 3 staff members in the country who were trained and licensed to fold and pack the Apollo parachutes were considered so indispensable that NASA officials forbade them to ever ride in the same car, to avoid their all being injured in a single accident. Despite its high-tech aura, we have lost sight of the extent to which the lunar mission was handmade. The race to the moon in the 1960s was, in fact, a real race, motivated by the Cold War and sustained by politics. It has been only 50 years, not 500, and yet that part of the story too is faded. One of the ribbons of magic running through the Apollo missions is that an all-out effort born from bitter rivalry ended up uniting the world in awe and joy and appreciation in a way it had never been united before and has never been united since. The mission to land astronauts on the moon is all the more compelling because it was part of a decade of transformation, tragedy and division in the United States. The nation's lunar ambition, we tend to forget, was itself divisive. On the eve of the launch of Apollo 11, civil rights protesters, led by the Reverend Ralph Abernathy, marched on Cape Kennedy. In that way, the story of Apollo holds echoes and lessons for our own era. A nation determined to accomplish something big and worthwhile can do it, even when the goal seems beyond reach, even when the nation is divided. Kennedy said of the Apollo mission that it was hard, we were going to the moon precisely because doing so was hard, and that it would serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills. And measure the breadth of our spirit as well.